Hay Group Insight is the survey research division of Hay Group. Specifically, we focused on employee effectiveness. And when I say employee effectiveness, we do actually include in that concept employee engagement, which is what a lot of organizations focus on and think is important. However, we actually look at employee effectiveness because we actually believe that it's not just enough to have people who are engaged, but ultimately you need to have people who can actually turn that engagement into productivity. And really what we see as the tie there to productivity is ultimately employee effectiveness. So what's the difference and what's the unique approach that we take at Hay Group Insight? Well, specifically, we focus in on starting with engagement. We think it's very important, and it does actually lead to higher levels of individual team and organizational performance and productivity. How do we define employee engagement? Well, specifically, we look at two elements. One, are people committed to the organization? Are they really driving forward and wanting to stay at the organization? But even more than that, do they actually have pride in the organization? And are they willing to recommend other people to actually come to the organization? But in order to get engagement, you need to have more than just people who want to stay at the organization. You want to have people who are actually willing to give discretionary effort on behalf of the organization. So coming together, both the commitment and the discretionary effort components really ultimately ends with employee engagement. And in fact, like other organizations, we see that those organizations who have high levels of employee engagement also have high levels of individual team and organizational performance. But you can imagine an individual who wants to give you that discretionary effort, but there's certain things that are standing in their way to be able to do that. What I always say is a great example of that is imagine that you're working in the evening on your computer and all of a sudden you're no longer able to get access to the corporate network or the internet. It's going to create a certain sense of frustration. And that's where we really see what we call employee enablement coming into place. And enablement, like engagement, is made up of two specific elements. One, we want to make sure that leaders put people in roles that fully utilize their skills and abilities so that when they are working, they're doing it in the best way. The second point is really about an organizational element. What is the organization going to do to help this individual be successful? And that's a lot about what are the support mechanisms that the organization puts in place. So for example, things like training, aspects of collaboration, and even work systems and processes that actually help that employee be successful. So coming back to the example of somebody who wants to work late, but their equipment isn't working correctly, you can actually see where there's a high level of engagement and motivation, but they really can't be productive because ultimately they don't have the tools that they need to be successful. Or in other words, they're engaged but not enabled. So let's take that a little bit further. We now think we have an employee who's both engaged and enabled. What's really the difference? Well, we've done a study across all of our clients in our database, and what we looked at are four different aspects of productivity. One is individual productivity. And again, you always hear when you talk about high levels of employee engagement, people who are willing to give the 110% effort. We see that exactly in our data. But if you can engage and enable employees, we actually see individual performance differences of up to 50% from those who are highly engaged and enabled from those who are not engaged nor enabled. So really at an individual level, you can really see some significant differences. Of course, turnover, again, that's all about engagement, but you also do see lower levels of turnover when somebody is both engaged and enabled. And in fact, what we often find is your high performers who are continually pushing the envelope to achieve higher levels of performance often run into barriers that do decrease their enablement. And a lot of times what we find is that if you don't remove those barriers, those high performers can often be some of the first people who leave the organization and might do so without you knowing about it because otherwise they are actually quite engaged in the organization. As a CEO, why should you be thinking about whether or not your employees are engaged and enabled? The key difference is about revenue growth. And what we find is that when you have high levels of engagement, yes, you do have high levels of growth. And in fact, over a 5-year period, we see the revenue growth relative to your competitors will be 2.5 times, which is great, definitely something you want to consider. But if you get both high levels of engagement and high levels of enablement, you see that 2.5 time growth go up to 4.5 times. Or in other words, if your industry is growing at 2% a year, we can actually take you to 9% a year if you have both engaged and enabled employees.